March 7, 1944. The morning sky above the Devon coast carried the metallic grey weight of early spring, visibility stretching 15 miles across cold Channel waters. At Royal Air Force Exeter, Squadron Leader Richard Newbury watched two of his pilots sprint toward their aircraft. 610 Squadron had received their first Spitfire Mark 14s exactly 62 days earlier. The machines gleamed with unfamiliar power on the hardstand, their five-bladed propellers marking them as different from every other Spitfire variant the squadron had flown. Within minutes, Pilot Officer Hussey and Flight Sergeant Harding lifted from the grass strip, vectored toward three Focke-Wulf 190 Jabos detected racing toward the English coast at wave-top height. The chase lasted 11 minutes. Hussey opened throttle to combat emergency power, felt the Griffon 65 engine surge with 2050 horsepower, pushing the aircraft through 370 miles per hour at 2,000 feet. The Focke-Wulfs, Germany's finest low-altitude fighters, were running at maximum speed. Yet Hussey closed the distance. The engagement ended with one enemy aircraft claimed as damaged, but the encounter revealed something German fighter pilots across the Reich would spend the next 14 months learning through shock and fatal miscalculation. The Spitfire they thought they understood had transformed into something unprecedented. At medium and high altitudes, where most combat occurred over northwestern Europe, the Mark 14 could reach 448 miles per hour at 26,000 feet. No German piston-engine fighter could match this performance. More critically, the Spitfire retained its legendary maneuverability while gaining vertical climbing capability that defied contemporary aerodynamic assumptions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from wherein the world you are watching from today. German aces who had mastered tactics against earlier Spitfire variants suddenly confronted an aircraft that climbed faster, flew higher, and accelerated beyond anything their experience prepared them to counter. The psychological impact would prove as devastating as the technical superiority. This is the story of how German fighter pilots, men who had survived years of aerial combat and accumulated dozens of victories, encountered a machine that shattered their understanding of air warfare, not through revolutionary tactics or numerical superiority, but through engineering advancement so profound it rendered previous combat experience inadequate. The transformation began not with dramatic battles but through cumulative encounters where experienced pilots realized the sky no longer belonged to those who flew highest or fastest based on 1943 standards. By autumn 1944, when Spitfire Mark 14s arrived on the continent in squadron strength, the Luftwaffe faced an opponent that could dictate engagement terms at will. German pilots who attempted to climb away from pursuing Spitfires found themselves overtaken. Those who dived to escape discovered the Mark 14 followed effortlessly. Fighter tactics developed over 4 years of combat suddenly offered no reliable defense. The story of this technological leap requires understanding what German pilots expected from their opponents, how British engineering achieved the unexpected, and why 957 aircraft could exert such disproportionate psychological influence over the final year of aerial warfare in Europe. To understand the shock that Spitfire Mark 14 pilots delivered to the Luftwaffe, one must comprehend the confidence German fighter pilots carried into 1944. These were not inexperienced men hoping for survival. Many had flown hundreds of combat missions. Dozens possessed victory totals exceeding 20 aircraft. Some aces commanded scores surpassing 50 kills. Their confidence rested on proven equipment and hard-won tactical knowledge. By January 1944, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav series formed the backbone of German fighter defenses. The G6 variant, introduced in early 1943, carried 13mm machine guns in the engine cowling and a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. With optional underwing cannon pods, the aircraft could deliver devastating firepower against American heavy bombers. The Gustav 6 reached 398 miles per hour at 20,600 feet altitude. Its service ceiling approached 39,000 feet. Rate of climb, approximately 3,345 feet per minute, remained competitive with contemporary Allied fighters. More importantly, German pilots understood the performance envelope of their primary opponent. The Spitfire Mark IX, which equipped the majority of Royal Air Force squadrons through 1943, represented a known quantity. German tactical manuals specified engagement procedures. The Mark IX, powered by the Merlin 63 engine developing 1660 horsepower, achieved maximum speed of approximately 408 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. British pilots flying Mark IXs had earned respect through skill and determination, but German pilots possessed reliable intelligence on aircraft capabilities. They knew at which altitudes the Messerschmitt held advantages. They understood how to exploit the Spitfire's limited combat radius. They had developed tactics for vertical combat maneuvers, where the German fighter's fuel injection system provided crucial seconds of advantage during negative G pushover. This knowledge represented survival itself. In winter 1944, Luftwaffe training programs had deteriorated catastrophically. New pilots reached operational squadrons with 60 flying hours, sometimes less. Fuel shortages curtailed training flights. The burden of defending Germany against 1,000-bomber raids fell increasingly on veterans whose experience compensated for numerical inferiority. These men relied on intimate knowledge of relative aircraft performance. They calculated combat geometry through instinct developed across hundreds of engagements. They knew precisely how much altitude advantage they required before initiating attack. They understood which maneuvers their aircraft could sustain and which their opponents could not match. The Focke-Wulf 190 series provided additional capability. The A-8 variant, introduced in 1944, mounted the BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower. Maximum speed reached approximately 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The 190's excellent roll rate at high speed, combined with heavy armament, made it formidable in diving attacks and high-speed passes. German tactical doctrine emphasized these strengths. Formations would position themselves above Allied bomber streams or fighter formations, then execute high-speed diving attacks, using superior speed in the dive to escape before Allied fighters could respond effectively. By spring 1944, however, American long-range fighters had begun contesting German air superiority throughout occupied Europe. The P-51 Mustang, with combat radius exceeding 400 miles, could escort bombers deep into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt, though less maneuverable than the Spitfire or Messerschmitt, carried tremendous firepower and could absorb extraordinary battle damage. German pilots faced increasingly unfavorable numerical odds and diminishing fuel supplies. Yet they retained one crucial advantage. They fought over their own territory. Damaged aircraft could attempt emergency landings at friendly airfields. Pilots who bailed out returned to service within days. This geographic advantage, combined with veteran experience and adequate aircraft performance, sustained Luftwaffe effectiveness through spring 1944, despite overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. German fighter pilots entering that spring believed they understood their opponent's capabilities thoroughly. The Spitfire Mark IX could be countered through altitude advantage and careful energy management. The Thunderbolt could be outmaneuvered. The Mustang presented serious challenges, but its pilots, often recently trained, could be exploited through superior tactical discipline. This confidence, built through thousands of combat sorties and validated by continued survival, would shatter against a technological transformation none of them anticipated. The Spitfire that German intelligence officers evaluated in early 1944 represented accurate assessment of the Mark IX. What they failed to anticipate was that British engineers had been working since 1942 on a fundamental transformation of the aircraft's power plant. The change would not involve incremental improvement. It would constitute a revolutionary leap in capability. Rolls-Royce had developed the Merlin engine family since the mid-1930s, progressively increasing power output through improved supercharging and higher boost pressures. By 1943, the Merlin had reached practical limits of development without complete redesign. Meanwhile, Rolls-Royce engineers had been developing an entirely different engine, the Griffon, based on the racing engines that powered Supermarine's Schneider Trophy seaplanes in the 1930s. displaced 2,040 cubic inches compared to the Merlin's 1,650. More critically, the Griffon 65 employed a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output at high altitude, far better than single-stage systems. In standard configuration, the Griffon 65 developed 2050 horsepower at 8,000 feet, with 150-octane fuel and emergency boost settings introduced in mid-1944. Output reached 2,450 horsepower briefly. This represented approximately 50% more power than the Merlin 63 that propelled the Spitfire Mark IX. The engineering challenge lay in installing this substantially larger, heavier engine into the Spitfire airframe without destroying the aircraft's legendary handling characteristics. Supermarine's design team, led by Joe Smith after R.J. Mitchell's death in 1937, approached the problem methodically. They selected the Mark 8 airframe, already strengthened to accommodate the Merlin 61, as the foundation. The Griffon engine sat farther forward in the cowling to maintain proper center of gravity. A 5-bladed Rotol propeller, 11 feet in diameter, replaced the 4-bladed units on earlier Spitfires. The increased propeller diameter necessitated lengthening the landing gear slightly to maintain ground clearance. Internal systems required extensive redesign. The Griffon rotated opposite to the Merlin, meaning torque effects during takeoff reversed direction. Pilots accustomed to Merlin-powered Spitfires veering left on takeoff discovered the Mark 14 pulled strongly right, requiring immediate full left rudder application to maintain directional control. The cooling system, always critical in liquid-cooled engines, demanded larger radiators to dissipate the Griffon's additional heat output. Engineers positioned these radiators in the wings, creating distinctive chin and underwing cooling intakes that marked the Mark 14 visually. The first prototype flew on January 20, 1943. Test pilots immediately recognized revolutionary performance. Jeffrey Quill, Supermarine's chief test pilot, reported climb rates exceeding 4,500 feet per minute at sea level. Maximum speed at rated altitude surpassed 440 miles per hour even before 150-octane fuel became available. Perhaps most impressive, the aircraft retained the Spitfire's light, responsive controls throughout its speed range. High-speed handling, often problematic in fighters as performance increased, remained predictable and precise. Production orders followed rapidly. The first Mark 14s left Supermarine's factories in October 1943. No. 610 Squadron received the initial 8 aircraft on January 6, 1944. By March, when Pilot Officer Hussey and Flight Sergeant Harding chased those Focke-Wulf Jabos across the Channel, the squadron had begun operational sorties. German intelligence failed to recognize immediately what had arrived. Initial encounters were dismissed as isolated incidents, perhaps a few experimental aircraft, perhaps Allied pilots exaggerating performance, perhaps mistaken identification. The systematic truth emerged gradually through accumulated encounters that could not be explained away. The transformation that British engineers achieved through the Griffon installation transcended simple performance improvement. The Mark 14 could operate effectively at altitudes where earlier Spitfires struggled. It could sustain high-speed pursuit where previous variants lost ground. Most critically for combat effectiveness, it could climb at rates that rendered traditional German energy fighting tactics obsolete. German pilots who zoomed to altitude after an attack, expecting to regain energy advantage for the next pass, discovered Spitfire Mark 14s climbing beside them, accelerating through vertical maneuvers that should have been impossible. The psychological implications would prove as significant as the technical advantages. When experienced combat pilots encounter performance they cannot explain through existing knowledge, confidence erodes rapidly. That erosion, multiplied across hundreds of engagements throughout 1944 and early 1945, would fundamentally alter German fighter pilot psychology during the war's final year. The transformation in German pilot experience occurred through specific, documentable encounters that could not be dismissed as isolated anomalies. Each engagement provided data points that accumulated into undeniable conclusions. The pattern emerged clearly by summer 1944, when Spitfire Mark 14s began appearing over northwestern Europe in sufficient numbers to generate systematic contact reports. On December 8, 1944, No. 130 Squadron operated armed reconnaissance missions covering Dülmen, Hamm, and Münster in northwestern Germany. Wing Commander Kiefer led 10 Spitfire Mark 14s at low altitude, hunting ground targets. At 15:05 hours, near Bergstein, Yellow Section attacked a locomotive with freight cars. The squadron's combat reports, preserved in Royal Air Force archives, document what happened next with clinical precision. Flying Officer K.M. Lowe, an Australian pilot serving as Blue 1, patrolled at deck level when Yellow Section reported enemy aircraft. He immediately turned starboard toward the train and spotted 5 enemy aircraft at 2,000 feet, flying line astern in a port turn. Lowe climbed and selected the last aircraft, closing in a rate 2 turn. He opened fire with all armament from 250 yards, using 1.5 rings deflection. The 3-second burst produced no visible result. Closing to approximately 150 yards, the enemy aircraft, a Focke-Wulf 190, took no evasive action whatsoever. Lowe fired again, observing strikes on the engine. The aircraft caught fire, hovered momentarily in the air, then dived straight into the ground. What appeared to be the pilot exiting the aircraft showed no parachute opening. Pilot Officer F.C. Riley, also Australian, flying as Red 2, witnessed different aspects of the same engagement. While covering Wing Commander Kiefer's tail through cloud, Riley descended and began orbiting at approximately 1,000 feet. An enemy aircraft, later identified as a Messerschmitt 109, approached from his port side. Riley turned hard into the attack. The German pilot broke off immediately, diving away. Riley followed, opening fire at 300 yards range with a 4-second burst. The enemy aircraft went into a steep dive with glycol streaming from the engine. Riley watched it crash into the ground and explode. The combat reports reveal crucial details about German pilot behavior. Multiple experienced Luftwaffe pilots made no attempt at evasive maneuvers when first engaged. The Focke-Wulf pilot that Lowe attacked maintained straight flight, even as cannon strikes damaged his engine. This behavior indicates either complete tactical surprise or inability to respond effectively to the Spitfire's performance. German fighter doctrine emphasized maintaining awareness of threats and executing immediate evasive action when under attack. The failure to respond suggests these pilots did not recognize the threat until too late. They may have assumed the pursuing aircraft was a Spitfire Mark 9, which they understood could be countered through specific maneuvers. By the time they realized they faced different performance characteristics, options had vanished. Flight Lieutenant Ian Ponsford, who would credit 7 victories while flying Spitfire Mark 14s with No. 130 Squadron, later recalled the aircraft's capabilities in post-war interviews. His testimony, recorded by aviation historians, provides insight into the pilot's experience. The Spitfire Mark 14 was the most marvelous aeroplane at that time, and I consider it to have been the best operational fighter of them all, as it could outclimb virtually anything. The earlier Merlin Spitfire may have had a slight edge when it came to turning performance, but the Mark 14 was certainly better in this respect than the opposition we were faced with. Ponsford's assessment emphasizes the climbing performance that German pilots found most shocking. Traditional fighter tactics relied heavily on energy management. A pilot who found himself at disadvantage could zoom climb to regain altitude and energy advantage for subsequent attack. German pilots attempting this maneuver against Spitfire Mark 14s discovered their opponent climbing beside them, often overtaking them in the vertical. This negated decades of tactical doctrine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical specifications explain why German pilots experienced such profound tactical confusion. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the most common German fighter in late 1944, climbed at approximately 3,345 feet per minute. The Spitfire Mark 14, at combat weight with standard boost settings, climbed at approximately 4,580 feet per minute at sea level. This 37% advantage in climb rate translated to overwhelming tactical superiority in vertical maneuvers. A German pilot who zoomed to 10,000 feet altitude expecting to gain separation found the Spitfire, arriving at the same altitude seconds later, positioned for attack. The performance disparity extended across the flight envelope. Maximum speed advantage favored the Spitfire at virtually every altitude. At 20,000 feet, where much combat occurred over Germany, the Mark 14 achieved approximately 430 miles per hour, while the Bf 109 G6 reached approximately 398 miles per hour. At 26,000 feet, the Spitfire's performance peaked at 448 miles per hour, while German fighters struggled to maintain 400 miles per hour. Wing Commander Peter Brothers, commanding Culmhead Wing in 1944 and a Battle of Britain veteran, described encountering German formations in post-war accounts. It was truly an impressive machine, being able to climb almost vertically. It gave many Luftwaffe pilots the shock of their lives when, having thought they had bounced you from a superior height, they were astonished to find the Mark 14 climbing up to tackle them head-on, throttle wide open. Brothers' testimony reveals the psychological dimension of technical superiority. German pilots who executed perfect bounce attacks from altitude advantage, following textbook doctrine, discovered their targets not fleeing defensively but climbing directly toward them. This inverted the fundamental assumption of fighter combat that altitude equals energy equals advantage. When lower aircraft can climb faster than higher aircraft can dive or accelerate, traditional energy fighting collapses. The evidence accumulated through hundreds of similar encounters throughout autumn and winter 1944. German squadron intelligence officers compiled reports from surviving pilots describing impossible performance, aircraft that should not exist, Spitfires that climbed like rockets and accelerated beyond any Merlin-powered variant. The reports were dismissed initially as pilot error or misidentification. Perhaps pilots were encountering the new Hawker Tempest, known for exceptional low-altitude performance. Perhaps they were exaggerating enemy capabilities to excuse losses. But the reports continued. They came from experienced pilots, men with dozens of victories, men who knew aircraft recognition thoroughly. They described specific markings, specific squadron codes, specific aircraft profiles that matched Spitfire configuration. The performance described, however, exceeded Luftwaffe intelligence assessments of Spitfire capability by substantial margins. German intelligence services maintained comprehensive files on Allied aircraft throughout the war. The Technisches Amt, responsible for technical intelligence, operated captured aircraft testing programs. The Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, Germany's primary military test center, evaluated multiple captured Spitfire variants. Daimler-Benz tested Spitfires to compare performance against German engines. Messerschmitt studied captured examples to understand structural and aerodynamic solutions. By early 1944, German engineers possessed detailed knowledge of Spitfire Mark 9 performance characteristics. What they did not possess was knowledge of the Griffon 65 installation or its performance implications. British security surrounding the new engine remained effective through spring 1944. The first Griffon-powered Spitfires, the Mark 12s, had appeared in limited numbers in 1943, but operated primarily in coastal defense roles against low-altitude Focke-Wulf raids. Few were lost to enemy action, meaning few examples became available for German technical evaluation. The Mark 14, entering service in January 1944, initially equipped only No. 610 Squadron. German intelligence could track squadron equipment through various sources, including signals intelligence, prisoner interrogation, and reconnaissance photography. But identifying a new Spitfire variant from external appearance proved difficult. The Mark 14 resembled the Mark 9 in overall configuration. Both featured similar wing shapes, similar fuselage profiles, similar paint schemes. The most obvious visual difference, the 5-bladed propeller, could not be reliably identified from combat encounter distances or from reconnaissance photographs taken at operational altitudes. German pilots reporting encounters with exceptionally fast Spitfires were told they had fought Mark 9s with experienced pilots. The performance they described must be exaggeration or misperception caused by combat stress, when pilots insisted the aircraft they encountered performed far beyond Mark 9 capabilities. Intelligence officers suggested they had encountered Hawker Tempests, which were known to have exceptional low-altitude speed. This explanation satisfied no one who had actually seen the aircraft. The first concrete evidence that British forces had deployed substantially improved Spitfire variants reached German intelligence through captured examples. In late 1944, damaged Spitfire Mark 14s forced landed or crashed in areas where German forces could recover them. Technical examination revealed the Griffon engine immediately. Engineers recognized the significantly larger displacement and different supercharger configuration. Performance extrapolation from engine specifications indicated capabilities far exceeding previous Spitfire variants. The intelligence reports generated from these examinations circulated through Luftwaffe command structure, but arrived too late to influence tactical doctrine effectively. By December 1944, 6 Spitfire Mark 14 squadrons operated with 2nd Tactical Air Force. Production was accelerating. 957 Mark 14s would ultimately be built, a small number compared to total Spitfire production of over 20,000 aircraft, but sufficient to equip elite squadrons and provide critical capability where needed most. The intelligence failure extended beyond simple lack of information. German technical intelligence by late 1944 suffered from systematic weaknesses rooted in Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Fuel shortages restricted flight testing of captured aircraft. Allied bombing disrupted test facilities. Personnel losses degraded institutional knowledge. Most critically, German aviation industry struggled to match Allied technological pace, even when German engineers understood Allied capabilities. Translating that understanding into operational German aircraft required months of development work and industrial resources Germany no longer possessed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 K4, introduced in autumn 1944, represented Germany's attempt to match Allied fighter performance. It employed the Daimler-Benz 605D engine with improved supercharging, developing approximately 2,000 horsepower with methanol water injection. Maximum speed reached approximately 440 miles per hour at 24,600 feet. This represented substantial improvement over the G-series, bringing German performance closer to Allied standards. But closer proved insufficient. The Mark 14 still held speed advantage at most altitudes. More importantly, the K4 arrived in limited numbers. By war's end, only approximately 700 K4s had been delivered, compared to thousands of G-series aircraft still in service. German pilots flying the K4 against Spitfire Mark 14s reported more competitive performance but not superiority. The British aircraft still climbed faster and could dictate engagement terms. German tactical doctrine adapted as far as possible given performance constraints. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged turning engagements, to use diving attacks from altitude advantage when possible, to disengage rapidly if pursued. These defensive tactics represented survival techniques, not paths to victory. They acknowledged German fighters could no longer reliably defeat Allied aircraft in even combat. The psychological impact of this recognition pervaded Luftwaffe fighter force by early 1945. Veterans who had dominated European skies in 1940 and 1941 now fought defensively, seeking to survive missions rather than destroy enemies. New pilots, arriving at operational squadrons with minimal training, learned immediately they flew inferior aircraft against superior opponents. Survival depended on avoiding combat when possible and executing hit-and-run attacks when forced to engage. The confidence that sustained fighter pilots through dangerous missions eroded steadily as technical inferiority became undeniable. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a highly experienced fighter leader who would survive the war with 176 victories, later described the period in memoirs published during the 1950s. His recollections, though written with post-war perspective, captured the frontline pilots' experience. Experienced German pilots understood by late 1944 they fought losing battles against technologically superior opponents, supported by overwhelming industrial capacity. Individual skill and tactical brilliance could achieve local successes but could not alter strategic outcome. The morning of March 2, 1945, near Rheine-Hopsten airfield in northwestern Germany, crystallized the transformation German fighter pilots had experienced over the preceding year. No. 125 Wing, consisting of Spitfire Mark 14 squadrons, including No. 350 Belgian Squadron and No. 130 Squadron, launched a fighter sweep over Luftwaffe airfields. Their mission: intercept German fighters protecting Messerschmitt Me 262 jet operations. The jets represented Germany's technological counter to Allied numerical superiority, but they remained vulnerable during takeoff and landing. German fighter units assigned to protect the jets faced impossible missions: defend slow, vulnerable aircraft during their most critical flight phases against faster or more maneuverable Allied fighters operating with numerical advantage and complete tactical flexibility. Jagdgeschwader 27, 3rd Gruppe, scrambled approximately 14 Messerschmitt Bf 109 K4s that morning. These represented the latest German production fighters, equipped with the most powerful engines available. The unit also included some Bf 109, G10s and G14s, older variants pressed into service due to K4 production shortages. Nearby, 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26 launched 17 Focke-Wulf 190 D9s, the long-nose variant powered by Junkers Jumo 213 engines. Together, these forces represented substantial defensive capability by March 1945 standards. 31 experienced fighters, flown by a mixture of veterans and hastily trained replacements, climbing to intercept Allied fighters over their own airfield. Allied radar detected the climbing German formations immediately. Ground controllers used radio to vector Spitfire squadrons against them. No. 130 Squadron spotted the Focke-Wulf 190 D9s first, climbing from Hessepe airfield. The Spitfires dove to attack at low altitude, engaging the German formation. 7 Spitfire Mark 14s of No. 350 Belgian Squadron remained at altitude as top cover. Fighter controllers vectored them toward 3rd Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 27's Messerschmitt 109s, attempting to join the fight. What followed demonstrated conclusively the performance disparity German pilots had been reporting for months. The Belgian pilots, though described by some observers as an absolute rabble of flyers, very tenacious and excitable, possessed thorough Royal Air Force training and flew aircraft with decisive performance advantages. The German formation, climbing through overcast clouds, struggled to maintain cohesion. Some pilots were apparently barely capable of keeping formation in instrument meteorological conditions. This made No. 350 Squadron's interception devastating. Flight Lieutenant Mike Donnet engaged a Messerschmitt 109 at approximately 7,000 feet altitude. He closed rapidly, opened fire, and observed strikes on the fuselage. The German aircraft caught fire and spun into the ground near Lingen. Warrant Officer Robert Powells attacked another Messerschmitt, hitting it severely but running out of ammunition before confirming its destruction. The damaged aircraft was credited as damaged rather than destroyed. Sous-Lieutenant Jean-Marie Marchand shot down a 3rd Messerschmitt 109. Flying Officer de Pauw destroyed a 4th. All 7 Belgian pilots returned safely to Eindhoven for breakfast. No. 350 Squadron claimed 3 Messerschmitt 109s destroyed and 1 damaged. German records confirm 3rd Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 27, lost 3 Bf 109. K4 pilots killed that morning. Fähnrich Karl-Heinz Eidam, Feldwebel Karl Schaffhauser, and Unteroffizier Erich Schulz. All 3 were shot down during the engagement with Belgian Spitfires. Meanwhile, No. 130 Squadron's fight with the Focke-Wulf 190 D9s and additional Messerschmitt 109s resulted in 4 German aircraft claimed destroyed. 2 Spitfires were lost. The engagement demonstrated several critical factors. First, even when German forces possessed numerical advantage, 31 German fighters against fewer than 20 Spitfires, they could not achieve tactical success. Second, the Spitfire Mark 14's performance allowed Allied pilots to engage or disengage at will. German pilots could not force combat on favorable terms nor escape when disadvantaged. Third, and most psychologically devastating, German pilots flying the latest equipment available, the Bf 109K4 that represented months of development work and Germany's best remaining engineering, still faced defeat against Allied aircraft and pilots. Surviving German pilots from these engagements faced one final challenge after landing, explaining what had happened. How could modern fighters, flown by experienced pilots, fail so completely against comparable numbers of enemy aircraft? The answer, increasingly clear by spring 1945, lay not in pilot skill or tactical execution, but in fundamental technical inferiority. German fighters could not match Allied performance, German production could not match Allied numbers, German training programs could not match Allied pilot preparation. The cumulative weight of these disadvantages proved insurmountable. The psychological shift this recognition created pervaded the Luftwaffe fighter force during the war's final months. Pilots understood they fought for survival, not victory. Each mission meant running gauntlet against superior forces equipped with superior machines. The confidence that earlier German pilots had carried into combat, the certainty that skill and tactics could overcome numerical odds, had evaporated. In its place remained grim determination and fatalistic acceptance of probable death. This transformation from confidence to resignation, from tactical superiority to desperate defense, marked the Spitfire Mark 14's most profound impact. The aircraft's technical specifications mattered less than the psychological effect those capabilities produced in opponents. German pilots who had mastered their profession through years of combat discovered their expertise rendered inadequate by engineering advancement they could neither match nor counter. The sky, once German-dominated, had become an Allied realm where Luftwaffe fighters survived only through luck and circumstance, rather than skill and determination. The cost of technological dominance manifested in ways both stark and subtle during the war's final months. For German pilots who survived encounters with Spitfire Mark 14s, the psychological burden proved as heavy as any physical wound. Oberst Günther Rahl, who would finish the war with 275 victories, later spoke candidly about the transformation veteran pilots experienced. In interviews conducted during the 1970s, Rahl described how experienced fighter leaders watched younger pilots, men with barely 100 hours of total flying time, to climb into cockpits knowing they likely flew toward death. The Spitfire Mark 14 represented not just superior performance but the visible manifestation of Germany's industrial collapse. Every encounter reinforced the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare against opponents who could replace losses while German squadrons dwindled. Squadron leader Richard Newberry's 610 Squadron continued operations through the war's conclusion, their Spitfire Mark 14s accumulating victories against German jets, fighters, and ground targets. The unit's combat records document steady progression from that first engagement on March 7, 1944, through the final days of April 1945. Individual pilots gained experience and confidence. The aircraft itself proved remarkably reliable despite its high-performance power plant. Technical problems that plagued some advanced aircraft designs never materialized with the Mark 14. The Griffon engine, though powerful and demanding, demonstrated consistent performance under combat conditions. Ground crews maintained readiness rates that exceeded expectations for such a sophisticated machine. The immediate aftermath saw the Spitfire Mark 14 continue service beyond victory in Europe. Royal Air Force squadrons deployed Mark 14s throughout the Mediterranean theatre and the Far East. Against Japanese aircraft in Burma and Malaya, the Mark 14 proved even more dominant than against German opponents. Japanese fighters, optimized for maneuverability at the expense of speed and structural strength, faced catastrophic disadvantages against the British fighter. Combat reports from these theatres describe one-sided engagements where Japanese pilots attempted traditional turning battles only to find Spitfire pilots refusing engagement on those terms, instead using superior speed and climb rate to control combat geometry absolutely. For the German pilots who survived the war, the Spitfire Mark XIV occupied specific space in their memories. It represented the moment when skill alone became insufficient. Major Heinz Baer, who survived with 220 victories, later distinguished between different Allied fighters in his recollections. The Mustang impressed him with range and capability. The Thunderbolt earned respect for ruggedness. But the Spitfire Mark XIV, he noted, combined all the traditional Spitfire qualities, the maneuverability and gentle handling, with performance that exceeded German aircraft capabilities. This combination proved psychologically devastating because it denied German pilots any consolation. They couldn't rationalize defeat as trade-off between different design philosophies. The Mark XIV simply performed better across every relevant metric. The aircraft's production numbers, 957 total, remained modest compared to other Spitfire variants. Yet this relatively small force exerted influence disproportionate to numerical strength. The Mark XIV appeared where combat intensity ran highest, over northwestern Europe during the final year of war. It equipped elite squadrons with experienced pilots. Most critically, it arrived at precisely the moment when German fighter defenses had been stretched to breaking point. Every additional capability advantage mattered when Luftwaffe pilots faced impossible odds daily. The Spitfire Mark XIV didn't single-handedly defeat the Luftwaffe fighter force, but it accelerated the collapse by removing any remaining areas where German pilots could claim technical parity or superiority. The sky, in every dimension, belonged to the Allies. German pilots understood this truth viscerally every time they encountered the distinctive silhouette of a Griffon-powered Spitfire climbing toward them with relentless speed. The Spitfire Mark XIV's legacy extended far beyond victory tallies and combat reports into the fundamental evolution of fighter aircraft design philosophy. British engineers working on the Mark XIV confronted challenges that would define jet-age fighter development. The transition from Merlin to Griffon engine required managing significantly increased torque, demanding strengthened airframe components and revised flight control systems. The contra-rotating propellers eventually fitted to some Mark XIVs represented innovative solutions to problems that would recur throughout aviation history. Every lesson learned, maintaining high-performance piston engines at operational readiness, informed subsequent jet engine development programs. Post-war analysis revealed how close British designers had come to reaching absolute limits of piston engine fighter performance. The Mark XIV achieved 448 miles per hour at altitude, through combination of powerful engine, refined aerodynamics, and structural strength sufficient to handle tremendous stress. Further performance gains would have required weight increases that negated speed improvements or structural modifications so extensive they essentially created new aircraft. The Mark XIV represented evolutionary endpoint, the final development of concepts stretching back to the original Spitfire prototype that first flew in 1936. This recognition influenced Royal Air Force planning as jet fighters entered service. The Mark XIV proved that conventional fighter design had been perfected rather than exhausted. Several Mark XIVs survived into preservation, becoming treasured artifacts documenting Britain's aircraft industry achievements. The aircraft maintained flying status demonstrate performance that still impresses modern observers. Pilots qualified on the type describe handling characteristics that balance power with controllability. The Griffon engine's distinctive sound, deeper and more aggressive than Merlin-powered variants, becomes immediately recognizable at airshows and heritage flights. These surviving aircraft serve educational purpose beyond mere nostalgia. They represent tangible connection to period when engineering advancement occurred through incremental refinement rather than revolutionary transformation. The Mark XIV shows what could be achieved by perfecting existing technology rather than pursuing radical innovation. For historians examining the air war over Europe, the Spitfire Mark XIV occupies unique position. It appeared too late to influence the war's outcome significantly, yet early enough to affect combat dynamics during crucial final year. Without the Mark XIV, would Allied air superiority have been established less completely? Would German jet fighter operations have proven more effective without high-performance conventional fighters suppressing them during vulnerable takeoff and landing phases? These questions remain hypothetical, but illuminate the aircraft's significance. The Mark 14 didn't win the war, but it did help shape how that victory was achieved, the pace at which German defences collapsed, and the psychological impact sustained by Luftwaffe pilots during final desperate months. The human cost embedded in this legacy deserves acknowledgement. German pilots killed flying against Mark 14s died fighting battles they understood were futile. Young men with inadequate training climbed into obsolescent fighters to face opponents with every advantage. The technological disparity that made the Mark 14 so effective also ensured these encounters would be massacres. This reality troubles comfortable narratives about aviation progress. The Mark 14's success was built partly on engineering excellence, but also on systematic destruction of brave men flying inferior equipment in service of criminal regime. Understanding this duality becomes essential for honest historical assessment. Royal Air Force pilots who flew the Mark 14 carried different memories into peacetime. Many described the aircraft with genuine affection, appreciating its performance and reliability. They understood the technical advantages they possessed and felt no shame about exploiting them. War meant using every available resource to achieve victory. The Mark 14 gave them capability to control combat, to engage or disengage based on tactical assessment rather than enemy action. This autonomy, the freedom to fight on their own terms, represented luxury denied to German opponents. The aircraft enabled competent pilots to become effective ones, and transformed skilled pilots into dominant forces. This legacy of capability and confidence endured long after the war ended, shaping how a generation of military aviators understood their profession and their aircraft. Return now to that March morning in 1944, to Squadron Leader Newbury watching his pilots sprint toward unfamiliar aircraft. In that moment, he couldn't know how the Spitfire Mark 14 would reshape aerial combat over the next 14 months. He understood only that his squadron had received powerful new machines and that his pilots would test them against experienced enemies. The engagement that followed, brief and inconclusive by later standards, initiated transformation in how air warfare would be conducted over northwestern Europe. German pilots who encountered these new Spitfires carried reports back to intelligence officers who struggled to credit the performance claims. How could the British have achieved such dramatic improvement? What engineering breakthroughs enabled this leap? The answers lay not in revolutionary technology but in methodical refinement. The Griffon engine represented logical development of successful design lineage. The five-bladed propeller solved known problems with power absorption. The strengthened airframe applied lessons from years of combat experience. Each component represented engineering excellence, but nothing beyond contemporary technical capability. The genius emerged from integration, from combining these elements into aircraft that performed beyond the sum of its parts. This lesson influenced post-war military aircraft development worldwide. Nations understood that technological superiority could be achieved through systematic improvement rather than requiring radical innovation. The larger World War II context reveals the Spitfire Mark 14's true significance. By 1944, the war's outcome had been determined by industrial capacity, strategic resources, and manpower mobilization. Individual weapons systems mattered primarily in how they affected timing and cost of victory. The Mark 14 accelerated Allied air superiority's establishment and reduced casualties by enabling more efficient combat outcomes. Every German aircraft destroyed by Mark 14 pilots meant one fewer threat to bomber streams, one fewer interceptor challenging reconnaissance missions, one fewer fighter attacking ground forces. These incremental effects accumulated into strategic impact that altered how quickly Germany's defences collapsed. Consider the alternative history where the Mark 14 never entered service. Allied air superiority would still have been achieved through numerical superiority and pilot training advantages, but the process would have taken longer, cost more lives, and allowed German jet fighter programs additional development time. The Mark 14 filled crucial role during precise historical moment when conventional fighter performance remained relevant, but existing aircraft approached obsolescence. It provided bridge between established designs and jet-powered future, maintaining Allied advantages during vulnerable transition period. The story that began, with Pilot Officer Hussey chasing Focke-Wulfs across Devon skies, concluded with Spitfire Mark 14s flying victory patrols over defeated Germany. In the span between these moments, 957 aircraft destroyed hundreds of enemy fighters, protected thousands of bomber crewmen, and contributed to air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe operations became death sentences rather than military missions. The psychological impact of this dominance reverberated through German fighter units, eroding morale and extinguishing hope among pilots who once believed skill could overcome material disadvantage. For those German aces who survived, men like Rahl and Baer and Steinhoff, the Spitfire Mark 14 occupied haunting space in memory. It represented a moment when their expertise became insufficient, when years of combat experience couldn't compensate for technical inferiority. They had been mastered not by more skilled opponents but by better machines flown by adequately trained pilots. This recognition carried weight that victory tallies never fully captured. The Mark 14 proved that wars are won through industrial capacity and engineering excellence as much as individual courage and tactical brilliance. The sky over Europe in 1945 belonged entirely to the Allies. The Spitfire Mark 14 helped ensure that dominance, one engagement at a time, until German pilots stopped climbing to meet their opponents, and victory became inevitable rather than aspirational. This is how wars end, not with dramatic reversals but with accumulated advantages that render resistance futile. The Spitfire Mark 14 represented that crushing reality in its most elegant, efficient, and deadly form. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.